so good to be with Mark. Mark is the rabbi in residence at the cathedral, and he teaches these wonderful courses that I never get to go to. So I schemed to have us do this so I could listen to Mark talk about the scriptures, and I'll throw in a few things as well. And so thanks for taking this on.
My pleasure.
And this is really an experiment. We'll see how this goes, and at the end there'll be questions. What we'll do is we'll do some teaching and then save questions for the end. But the format itself is something that we'll experiment with. Maybe we'll do it differently next time. So we invite people too who are watching on tape to make comments. Tell Vicky what you like and what you don't like, and we'll make adjustments to that. And then as we do this, we advertise it as the lectionary for the next 3 months: November, December, January. But obviously, we're not going to in 1 hour touch on all those readings and all those different things. So these are just kind of things that struck our soul as we were reading through them and praying about them. And so we'll be skipping around a little bit, but hopefully there'll be things in here that you can say, well, I could use that in a sermon. That's our hope.
Sounds good to me. So I just want to thank Doug. This is very exciting. It's been a great year just learning about the lectionary and being a part of the church, and now thinking about this lectionary. It's good that I'm doing this year with a better sense of the pattern of things. I just want to say a couple of things. When it comes to thinking about what's in these scriptural readings, there's a saying from early rabbinic tradition which says, in regard to the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, but it could go for all of Scripture, the saying is, turn it, for everything is in it. So when it comes to sermonizing, preaching, I would maintain that probably everything is there in every text every week, and it's just a question of whether we're there or what the circumstance is that sort of brings it alive. And when Doug and I had talked a few weeks back, somehow we were talking about text and responding to text, and I thought of Muhammad Ali's famous quote, "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee." And it does seem to strike me as a way to understand maybe how people preach. That when you are in a particular place at a particular day and your mind is wherever it is and you open the text, I think you kind of want to think of yourself as if you were floating like a butterfly over it. And then when the right thing happens, you don't want to sting, but you, as it were, you land on those verses or that phrase, and it suddenly comes alive in a way that you hadn't seen it. And I'm going to say just one more thing for those listening to us or those of us here today. You probably know, FYI, that the lectionary in the Christian setting is different than in the Jewish setting, and which is interesting for me. And just FYI, in the Jewish setting, we go through the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, in order. So you start with Genesis and you read all the way through, then Exodus onward through Deuteronomy. Then you do it all over. So there are 2 readings on a Sabbath morning. You have your Torah reading, which is running, as I said, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. It's divided up into 54 sections. Sometimes you pair them, so you only have 52 for a year. Anyway, you read all the way through. And then there are prophetic readings kind of associated with each Torah reading. So a Genesis reading would have a certain prophetic reading. So when I was teaching children, I would say it's sort of like you have a cupcake, but what's missing? You need the icing. So you've got your Torah reading, and it's complemented by its prophetic reading. So in the synagogue, then you've got 2 readings. In the church, you've got the Hebrew Bible and your New Testament, and a little bit extra. And in the Jewish setting, you've got this Torah with the prophetic reading, the cupcake with the frosting. And just one last thing. As it happens, we're meeting on this Wednesday. Tonight, as we meet tonight after this morning, is a Jewish festival called Simchat Torah, which happens to celebrate that the Jewish people have read through the entire Torah, and we're now starting a new year. So this evening and tomorrow morning in synagogues around the world, the last part of Deuteronomy will be read, and then people go directly into the reading of Genesis 1, verse 1. So if we're talking lectionaries and all that, we couldn't be meeting Jewishly at a better time than just at this point where We're finishing and just about to begin. And when you do that, there's a phrase everyone says, which is chazak, chazak, benit chazek, which means we finish this, may we be strong, and may we strengthen each other as we launch into a new book. So onward. We're here, the perfect day to be talking lectionary. So what shall I talk about first? All right, Sunday, November 26th, remember? There are two great texts there. There's an Ezekiel passage in which Ezekiel says, I will seek the lost and I will bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured and I will strengthen the weak. That's Ezekiel on that morning. And I love this. I thought sometimes I didn't see this clearly, but this is a perfect setup for the Matthew passage, 25. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. So I love the way that Ezekiel has this, I did this and I helped this and this and this. And the Matthew passage does the same piece. So it just caught me in terms of the poetry and the symmetry. I could tell you more. Shall I tell you more about what I want to do?
That's how we end our art cycle, or liturgical cycle. It's the last Sunday of the Matthew Gospel.
Right, of course it is. That's right. Yeah, so it's a perfect conclusion. So we're of course being told in the Matthew passage that God is going to come and do this for us. Shall we look at the passage? Well, I sort of paraphrase it, and you probably know it by memory, and I don't. So not fair, is it? Is it? But the Ezekiel I know a little bit better. Anyway, they're lovely passages. And what struck me, I'm actually going to hand a text out, because this notion that, well, I want to look at the Matthew passage. Do you mind? It's sure. 25.
Yeah.
I'm going to look because I'm going to get it better.
Then I'm going to talk about the two Matthew 25 passages that precede that.
Oh, all right. So let me just look. Let's look. If you've got, where is it here? It's Matthew 25. Just a second. So it's the passage we've got. It's verse 31. So Jesus is talking, and here's the piece I like so much. It paraphrases or follows up on the Ezekiel passage. You know, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was sick, you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. So there's this wonderful feeling of caring and all that. So it brought to mind some great passages that are rabbinic passages. So if you don't mind, I want to hand these out to you. So there's this great sense of where you find God, I think is the issue here. Where do you find God? Where does Jesus find something important? So there are three passages I want to share with you. I think you'll love these. At the upper left here, you'll see there's a passage here from something called Midrash Psalms. See the italics there? And you don't need to worry about that, but it's kind of a riff on a comment from Psalms 118, where the text tells us, open the gates of righteousness for me. And here is a rabbinic interpretation of that verse. At the time of judgment in the future world, everyone will be asked, what was your occupation? If the person answers, I used to feed the hungry, they will say to him, this is God's gate. You who fed the hungry may enter heaven. I used to give water to those who were thirsty. They will say to him, this is God's gate. You who gave water to those who were thirsty may enter. I used to clothe the naked. They will say to him, this is God's gate. You who clothe the naked may enter. And similarly, those who will enter heaven will be those who raised orphans, those who performed the commandment of charity, and those who performed acts of caring and loving kindness. I thought this is just...
It's almost identical, yeah.
It's a perfect parallel to the Matthew passage. And then the most spectacular passage is this one. This is from the Talmud down below. It's too long to read the whole thing, but there's a conversation going on here as to where the Messiah is. So I think I'll pick it up. Well, there are a lot of rabbis talking. Yehoshua ben Levi found Elijah the prophet, we know Elijah from Hebrew Bible, who was standing at the entrance of a cave where someone was buried, and said to him, "Will I be privileged to come to the world to come?" This rabbi asked Elijah, "Am I going to get into heaven?" Elijah said to him, "If this master, the Holy One, blessed be he, will wish it so." Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, "I saw Elijah and me, and the voice of three I heard." And then if you'll go down a little, I'm sorry, I'm reading and jumping here. "When will the Messiah come?" Now here's the key part. This is from the Talmud. Elijah the prophet said to him, "Go ask the Messiah." Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked, "And where is he sitting? Where's the Messiah?" Elijah said to him, "The Messiah is at the entrance of the city of Rome." Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked him, "And what is his identifying sign by means of which I can recognize him?" Elijah answered, "You're going to find the Messiah." Get this. "He sits among the poor who suffer from illnesses, and all of them untie their bandages and tie them all at once. But the Messiah unties one bandage and ties one at a time. He says, 'Perhaps I will be needed to serve to bring about the redemption. Therefore, I will never do more than one bandage at a time so that I will not be delayed.'" In other words, without getting caught up in the details here, the rabbis are suggesting in the Talmud, if you want to find the Messiah, you don't find him in some ethereal place. You find him at the gates of the city of Rome, of all places, and he's there binding up the wounds of the poor and the sick. And he's doing it one bandage at a time, because you never know when the Messiah will be called to redeem the whole world. So he doesn't want to be busy if he's undone too many bandages. One at a time. Wow. And I thought that's a great parallel to the Matthew passage, that God is to be found on the street and taking care of the poor. And I'll read one more passage, a Rebbe's proverb. This is a contemporary poem from a guy named Danny Siegel. "If you always assume the man sitting next to you is the Messiah, waiting for some simple human kindness, you will soon come to weigh your words and watch your hands. And if the Messiah so chooses not to reveal himself in your time, it will not matter." Okay, so there's my commentary on Matthew. What do you?
Well, it just reinforces the whole thing so much. And later on, not at this moment, I'm going to talk about John the Baptist, because he's a big part of the December readings. But all this goes to show the one thing that John the Baptist got wrong, because John the Baptist talked about the fact that Jesus, the Messiah, was coming. The axe would be laid to the root of the tree, and any tree that wasn't bearing good fruit would be cut down. And then he doubles down on that about the weeds. And then, but then when he's in prison, John sends his friends out to Jesus to say, "Are you the one? Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus says, "Well, tell John what you hear and see. The poor have good news preached to them. The blind see, the deaf hear." And then he ends with this incredible line. He says, "And blessed are those who do not take offense at me." Because he's saying that to John. He said, "I didn't bring the axe at the tree. I'm not cutting it all down. I'm doing these things, which is mentioned in Matthew 25, and which you mentioned here. That's where the Messiah is."
It's a very intriguing notion, isn't it? That that God is immanent as opposed to transcendent. Gosh, if I were a Christian, I might say that's what the incarnation's all about.
Yeah.
Might I say that?
You can say that.
Well, there's this give and take between the matter of transcendence and immanence, right? And where do you find God?
Yeah. I talk about fluffy spirituality and spirituality that's right here. God is not an abstraction for both of our religious traditions. God, right. There's a very, that's why the text speaks really in a loving way to imagine finding God at the gates of Rome. I mean, that's an intriguing notion, that they don't put God at the gates of Jerusalem, by the way. He's at the gates of Rome in this Talmud passage. And what would Rome represent?
Well, Rome is the entity that destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed Judah. So Rome is the worst of the worst, the enemy. Rome is the worst of the worst. So that suggests that the Messiah is to be found in the most dangerous, in the worst of the worst, at Times Square. The Messiah is at Times Square, and not up on wherever on Fifth Avenue or something like that.
Wow.
I'm not even sure what to do with it all, but I just love these images of that imminence and the possibility that what we do is prayerful when we don't even know we're doing it, and it's prayerful, F-U-L-L. It does change your approach towards life if you actually think that everybody's created in the image of God. I mean, if you actually take it seriously.
Well, like the famous vision that Thomas Merton had right on the streets of 4th and Walnut in Louisville this one day. So, Thomas Merton. The
yes, yeah.
And now he was outside the monastery because he had to go for a doctor's appointment somewhere. And so now he's in Lexington, and it's on Louisville, on the 4th and Walnut. And he has this vision that all the people he sees are just light up. They're all God's beloved. And he says he felt like bowing down to each person because God's presence was in them. And as he said, it didn't happen when he was in the monastery. It happened when he was on 4th and Walnut.
Nice. It's very, very hard work. I mean, even as I'm saying it, I'm thinking about somebody I was really angry at last night. And I'm thinking, I don't know, is that person really created in the image of God? That is, I mean, that's a phrase which is used, I know it's common to us all because it's biblical, but in Jewish tradition, that notion of being created in the image of God, that's a big phrase that's recurrent. It's recurrent. There's a prayer we have in our prayer book which says, "Thank you, God, for creating me," this, that, whatever. And thank you. One of the prayers is, "Thank you, God, for creating me, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God." Should probably say, "Thank you, God, for creating other people, B'Tselem Elohim," because we all probably personally think I'm definitely in the image of God. The trick is, can you actually believe it of somebody else, that they're created in the image of God?
Yeah. And that's a tension in Matthew's gospel, and all the gospels, is this notion of the second coming of the Messiah. That Jesus will come again.
Yeah.
And so I'll go into that for a second, but that then gets belied by this very passage that you just talked about in terms of Matthew 25. It's, in a lot of ways, don't tell anybody it says, don't tell the bishop, but the second coming has already happened. I mean, the Messiah is already among us. And so, in Matthew 25 reveals that. And so, but there's this tension, especially when the time the Gospels were written, because there's this expectation that Jesus would come back again, and now generations are dying off, and he hasn't come back again. So the Gospels are written with that tension in mind, that already but not yet. Yeah. So I'd like to look for a couple.
Sure. I have to find my notes.
Two passages in Matthew that reveal before that. So Matthew 25 is this. Matthew 25 in our tradition is something where if you say it, automatically you think of the story you just told. And there's even different communities, societies around our church that's called Matthew 25 societies. And you know what that means, that they're going to be serving the poor. So you think Matthew 25, you think that passage. But there are a couple of other passages in Matthew 25 besides that one. And that's also in our lectionary for this year. So the one, I'll deal with two of them here for a second, but the one that happens 2 weeks earlier is the one about the 10 virgins. And I'll just, again, sum it up. It's the 10 virgins who are waiting for the bridegroom. And the bridegroom can come at any time. So they've got these lamps. The lamps are lit. 5 of them brought enough oil, and 5 of them didn't. And so the 5 who didn't, the bridegroom still doesn't come. They want to borrow oil from the 5 that have it, and they say no. And so then they say, go and buy it. And so they leave, and now they're going and buying light for the oil for the lights. The bridegroom shows up, and the ones who were prepared, they're praised. And so that story is a story that a great sermon about this was by name is Anna Carter Florence. So some of you might have heard her. She's a great preacher. So I'm just going to quote a couple of things she has to say about this one. She says, "This morning we have a parable about the kingdom of heaven, in which 5 bridesmaids come prepared with enough oil to keep their lamps burning until the bridegroom comes, and 5 do not. Then the 5 wise bridesmaids refuse to share what they have, and they are praised for it. Then the 5 unprepared bridesmaids go and get to buy more oil, but they're out when the groom arrives and shuts the door to the banquet hall. And when the 5 unprepared bridesmaids finally get there and they knock on the door, he won't let them in. And Jesus told this story. As a person who has heard this story for the first time said, "Is that in the Bible?" Well, it's just not right. And then this preacher, she goes on to say, this parable about the bridesmaids flies in the face of key gospel stories. If taking care of yourself was the main message of the Gospels, the miracle of the loaves and the fishes would never have happened. Jesus would not have lifted a finger to help that hungry crowd who had neglected to pack a picnic lunch. Instead of the feeding of the 5,000, we would have had the moral of the very few who came prepared. So she's looking at it, she's pointing out how it seems so contradictory to everything else. And so that leads us to struggle with it, right? To struggle with what it means. And a key line in there, too, is this line about go and buy. So, for all of you biblical experts, where else did you hear the line go and buy? It's in Matthew's retelling of the feeding of the 5,000, right, where they've got the 5 loaves, 2 fishes. The disciples say to Jesus, we don't have enough food. Go tell the 5,000 to go and buy what they need. And Jesus says, no, take what you have, break it, give it away, and then God multiplies the grace. So it stands in tension of this. So on the one hand, I think what it has to say is something about our own formation, our own resources, are things that we get from a lot of different places, but we're going to need the resources. We're going to need the resources to go with what we have to deal with in life. And so it's in that case, what it means is someone else. You can't get it from someone else. You can't get the spirit, your own spiritual development from someone else. So where I would go with this is Rosemary Houghton wrote this book called The Transformation of Man. So pardon the sexist title. It was written in the 60s. The Transformation of Man. What she talks about there is that you have formation and transformation in your life. And you do all kinds of things in your life to make yourself a better person, right? You go to classes to make yourself smarter. A good friend of mine said that he always felt like he was getting smarter until he had teenagers. And then he realized I get dumber every day. But we do things called formation. But she says formation, you can never transform yourself. She says the transformation happens when your life falls apart and God's grace works and you've got to become a new creation. And so she says but the formation is really so important because the formation gives you the theology, the psychology, the spirituality to fall back on to make sense of the transformation. It makes sense of the transformation. So that she would say that transformation happens in the cracks of our lives. In the cracks of our lives.
I'm sorry.
No, go.
You remind me of that Leonard Cohen piece. You all know what I'm going to say, but I'm not going to get the quote quite right.
Ring the bell.
No. It's we're all broken. It's where the light gets in. It's through the.
There are cracks in everything, and that's
where the light gets in. Yes, there are cracks in everything. That's where the light gets in.
I actually heard a rabbinic story of to place the Torah on your heart, and so someone says, well, why don't you place the Torah in your heart? And the rabbi says that when your heart breaks, that's when the Torah enters.
Oh, interesting. Yes.
So I think this is a story that's a story about formation and transformation. So the formation is so important, but it's in transformation comes in the cracks. And then the other part of it, I think, is this experience of the oil runs out, And so in a preaching text, I think I would talk about in your life. Have you ever felt that the oil ran out? That you just didn't have enough left, and then we rely on grace.
So it's interesting in a sense that the text you just referred to was a kind of a challenge because it seemed to be a negative text. So sometimes we run into texts which we have to sort of struggle with, which may be the best texts, and we want to remain true to them. They just present us with huge challenges. I'm thinking in terms of texts which bespeak change. If you wanted to look at a text that bespoke change, there's a Jonah text coming up later on. Let's see if we could find the Rabbi's notes.
Yeah, the Rabbi's notes right here.
The Rabbi's notes are right here. They got buried by the bishop's notes. I don't understand. That's supersessionism, I guess. That's another topic. That's another topic. I mean, just to pick up on the notion of change, there's a passage from Jonah which is going to be read. Let me just tell you when it's going to be read. You may already know in the back of your heads. Third Sunday after Epiphany, Jonah gets read, which would be what? Let's see. It's the third Sunday, so it's December. I didn't put down. Want to look at it? Where is it here? Third Sunday after Epiphany, fourth Sunday. Yeah, it's December 21st. Is that right? Hold on. Yeah, it's December 21st. You don't actually have to look at it right now, but you might want to, somebody might want to speak on this Jonah passage. Because if you want to talk about change, Jonah's the man for talking about change. There is wonderful material in the very short passage here about Jonah. Yeah, the third Sunday after Epiphany. There's wonderful material here. And Jonah is the man on a journey. If you think about it, he's the man. Actually, there's somebody else on a journey. There's several people in the Bible who are on journeys, of course. Abraham's on a journey. And Abraham, as opposed to Jonah, he immediately responds to his challenge to say, I'm all there. Mm-hmm. So does Moses respond. Pretty much, I'm all there. A little bit of reluctance, but Jonah is the guy Jonah's the guy who tries to kind of evade it, and he's not sure. So I have a whole bunch of thoughts. If you ever wanted to change, if you wanted to address the issue of Jonah, which comes up so beautifully in the lectionary, actually, there are a couple of things here. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. There's a whole sermon to be written about who deserves a second chance in your life. God apparently gives people second chances. You or I might want to think about, do we give people a second chance? Have you or I ever benefited from a second chance? Would we really give friends, relatives, a second chance? And Jonah himself, of course, is always in motion. He tries to run away from God, but he gets his big second chance. Let me just see if I can give you another good example here of this. I'll give you one lovely midrash. You notice that the people change in the story of Jonah. They do change. In the passage which is read on this third Sunday after Epiphany, there's a couple of verses which are left out. It's really interesting that they're not read. We're told that the king leads them in their repentance, in their change. So there's a rabbinic midrash which says, well, why would the king be the one to change? And they say it's because he's learned his lesson. You know who the king of Nineveh is? It's Pharaoh. Mm. After Pharaoh sees what happens at the Red Sea, and after Pharaoh sees his whole nation turned over and realizes how wrong he was, he flees. He never goes back to Egypt. And he flees to Nineveh. Yeah. He becomes the king of Nineveh. And when there's a chance to change, second time around, he does change, and he leads the people in repenting. Wow. I just love that text to imagine what would it take for you or for someone to become someone who could change. And Pharaoh is someone who's learned enough to say, it's time to change. Sometimes it's good to be willing to change. Not a bad time to be thinking about Third Sunday. So I'm going to be reading that. When am I going to be reading? Early January or January. A time when everything's actually frozen. Mm. People are frozen in January. And are they willing to be anything other than frozen? Can you thaw your heart? Can you change? Nice, link it up with the weather, and you've got I think an important something you might want to investigate. At frozen times, do you unfreeze? Yeah.
Wow.
Now, if it were 2 years ago, you'd actually refer to the movie Frozen.
Yeah.
Right? Was that what it's called? Yeah,
I
Frozen.
think it's probably have a sequel coming.
Yeah, you could probably play around with it though, and do that.
Yeah. Well, let's just go back and look at another story, Matthew 25.
Sure.
Which then will lead to a thing I'd like to ask you about
Okay.
A statement that's made, that Jesus makes in the resurrection that refers back to Genesis.
Okay, I'm ready.
So the next story in Matthew 25, which we can read before the famous Matthew 25, is the story of the talents. So everybody knows the talents, right? So the landowner leaves. He gives 5 talents to one person. He gives 2 to another, and he gives 1 to a third. And he comes back, and the one with 5 is doubled it to 10. The one who had 2 is doubled it to 4. The one said, "I knew you were a cruel master," and he said, "So I took the talent and I buried it, and now I give it back to you." And the master's furious, and he takes the 1 talent from the man who buried his talent and gives it to the one who had 10. And so it's a fascinating story, but something that I always looked at wasn't there anybody who was given a talent, 2 talents, however many, and lost it all? Like was the stock market so good back in 30 AD that no one ever lost the talent that they had, that they invested it and lost it? And so I considered that, and then this is kind of a rabbinic midrash on this. Is there a 4th person in that story who lost it all? And the 4th person in the story who lost it all is the person who's telling the story. Jesus lost it all. Jesus risked it all and lost it all, right? And that we know that God's response to that is that he literally raises Jesus from the dead. That he takes this story, which is a story of failure, and makes it a story of grace. It brings about new life. And so that leads to the famous Matthew 25. Where is he? He's alive in our world right now. And where are you going to find him? You're going to find him in the hungry. You're going to find him in those in prison. And then you continue on that story, because after Matthew 25 is when we get the trial, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And so Matthew 25 has this line where after the resurrection of Jesus, people see him. And Jesus says this line, where he says, "Go and tell," it's the women who see him. And Jesus says to them, "Go and tell my brothers." There's one other time in the whole Bible we hear "go and tell my brothers." And it's not in the Gospels, because it's interesting that Jesus never calls the disciples his brothers. He'll say, "Go tell my disciples." He'll say, "Go tell my friends." He never says, "Go tell my brothers," until the resurrection. So the only other place in the Bible that I know of, you might know another spot.
Well, now my mind's turning around. Okay, where would it be? I think I might know, but go ahead.
Where do you think it is?
Well, the only time there are brothers who show up in significance is with Joseph, the story of Joseph.
Yeah, exactly. And so he says, "Go and tell my brothers." And he says, "Go and tell my brothers that what you intended for evil, God intended for good."
Right, yeah.
Exactly. So Matthew's making the connection to that story to say the things that the Romans had intended for evil, God intended for good. That's the resurrection is the great reversal. Just as in Joseph, the great reversal is he's sold into slavery and ultimately winds up saving his own people. Go and tell my brothers.
Do you want me to give a sermon on that?
Yeah.
Well, the sermon would be, do you discern God's presence in your life? Can you say such a thing that God, and we've said earlier you could find God in Times Square or whatever, but do you actually discern God's presence anywhere in your life? Are there times when you do feel as if God is present to you?
Yeah.
That's a hard, well, no, it's not necessarily, no, it is difficult. It's not so easy. If you and I aren't clergy, but if you and I are speaking in a congregation, that's a fundamental and a profound and a good question to ask. Do you ever feel as if God is a part of your experience? That's a hard question and a tough question. It actually comes up, give me a moment, in one of the scriptural passages. Give me one moment, because it occurred to me that it was in there. Oh, give me just... I think it may come up in another... oh, I know where. There's one of the passages, I hope I've got it right. One of my favorite biblical stories. It's a Hebrew Bible story here. Yeah, it's the second Sunday after Epiphany. Second Sunday. It's 1 Samuel chapter 3. It's a story in which Samuel is sleeping in the tabernacle and he hears God calling. It's a grand story. If you recall the story, he's sleeping and he keeps on hearing Samuel, Samuel, and he goes to Eli and says, "Here I am." And Eli said, "I didn't call you." And then he goes back to sleep and he keeps on hearing God until finally he realizes he doesn't know it's God. He thinks it's Eli till he finally realizes God is speaking to him. If I were going to be speaking about a time and raising the question, I think this is a great text to raise that question. Do you hear God? Do you respond to God? And the Hebrew phrase is, "Here I am, hineni, here I am." So that I think there is a great sermon to be given on that Sunday, second Sunday after Epiphany. You could probably talk about whether you hear God or find God, and how do you make God present in your life.
Revelation is not ended.
Or you could say, do you respond, what is calling you? Do you say, are you present to the real needs of the people around you? So are you present to God? Or hineni, do you respond to the people who are in your life, who may or may, here's another sermon. God makes it easy by saying, "Samuel, Samuel." So all Samuel has to do is say yes. But probably in most of life, God doesn't say that to any of us. And probably in most of our lives, the people around us don't really speak out so obviously to us. They say nothing and just, they need us to respond. So can you hear people when they're not even speaking?
Great, yeah.
And crying for help. That could be a spouse or a child or a parent or a parishioner. In most cases, most people aren't that articulate as to say they need it. You just have to discern it. So I think that's in this passage for Samuel.
Would be great to preach on.
Yeah.
So I'll segue into another thing that you want to do. But just another preaching technique can be the end of a cycle and the beginning of a cycle. So it could be that in November you talk a little bit about Matthew's Gospel. So we always feel we've got to just address the readings of the day. When sometimes I think it's okay to summarize things that have gone on in the past year, and maybe even ask people beforehand what was their favorite story from Matthew. To kind of recap those things. And Matthew, as we know, and you taught a great course on this. I couldn't be at. Yeah. Matthew is the most Jewish of all the Gospels. Quotes the most prophets. It also sees the law as something that can guide us. So Matthew's got a lot in it. So it could be that as we come to the end of the cycle, you remind people of things that might have gone on previously in Matthew's Gospel.
I just want to say, I want to go back to the hineni. I know I'm using the Hebrew phrase, but that is how you say, "Here I am." That's what Samuel's being asked. Because I had another thought that, especially if you had, not necessarily, but if you did have children around, I could see a hineni Sabbath, "Here I am" Sabbath, where you identify 3 people who said hineni in the course of history and stood up and said hineni. I mean, Dr. King would be one of those, right? That's too easy. But you could easily find, and actually, second Sunday after Epiphany, no, it's too early for Martin Luther King weekend, but it's getting there. You could, I think, have a pretty interesting weekend inviting people to think about hineni figures in their lives or in history. Who are 3 people who stood up and said, "Count me in, I'm here"? They could be religious figures, political figures, or whatever. There's something called the Giraffe Heroes Project. Some of you may have heard of that. You know, a giraffe is someone who sticks out his neck. So if you Google Giraffe Heroes Project, there's a whole foundation which is dedicated towards identifying people who stood up and stuck out their necks in certain circumstances. So it doesn't have to only be spiritual, but the Samuel passage with a notion that sometimes you have to either respond to God's call or discern that there's something which calls you, you got to stand up. You could have a pretty interesting Sabbath if you probably gave 6 weeks notice and said, this is our time, and you chose 6 parishioners and say, I want you to choose somebody. You could even be that person. Show up and you be that giraffe, who do you think stood up in a way that you think all of us ought to know about? And you have six stories of 6 grand people. And the Giraffe Heroes Project identifies little people, big people who stood up and were counted. Anyway.
Stand up season.
Yeah, stand up.
We always like that.
Stand up Sabbath. Okay, stand up Sabbath.
Stand up season.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry. I didn't want to leave that as an idea that's makes a sermon more than just what you as a clergy person might say to people, but you introduce and 6 people are the sermon.
Yeah.
Or 5 people. They are the sermon standing beside you, saying, "Here I am."
Well, it's called witnessing to the faith, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
you had a question.
But no, just like in terms of Matthew's gospel, it's the end of the cycle. Then the new cycle picks up with Mark, right? So it could be that in Advent, when we get this great passage from Mark, right? The very first line is the beginning of the good news. And then it's the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. And it goes right into Mark's gospel. So interestingly, in Mark's gospel never ends. You know that? Because in Mark's gospel, there's actually no resurrection story in Mark's gospel. We get the death of Jesus, we get the empty tomb, and then the women go to the tomb. The angels say, "He's not here. He's gone ahead of you to Galilee. Go tell the people, do not be afraid. Tell them the good news." And then the next line is, "And they said nothing to nobody because they were afraid." And that ends the gospel. And so I think that the message in that is that the good news continues, just like we're saying now. You know, the good news continues. But Mark's gospel also has other things in it that you could point out to people that they will hear in the next year. So a big part of Mark's gospel, which is the shortest of the gospels, is he uses the word immediately 56 times. Immediately 56 times. And Mark's got this urgency about him. It's this urgency to accept God's love, this urgency to be part of this people of hope. And Jesus buys into that immediately. Jesus says immediately numerous times within Mark's gospel. Michael Curry's got this great line where Michael Curry says, you know, in Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel, we get the birth narratives, right? The birth of Jesus. And in John's gospel, we don't get the birth of Jesus. We get that great hymn about the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And there's no great hymn at the start of Mark's gospel. There's no birth narrative in Mark's gospel. He goes right into John the Baptist and the adult Jesus. And Mark Curry's line about that is that Mark has such urgency about this that he's got no time for the baby pictures. No time for this. We got to get right into the teaching of Jesus. So that's going to happen over and over again in Mark's gospel. And you can point to the feeding of the 5,000, as these folks know, is my favorite gospel story. And in Mark's gospel, it actually gets told twice, because a couple of days after the 5,000, he feeds the 4,000. But what Mark does is he has an explicit connection to the feeding of the 5,000 and the 23rd Psalm. So what he says is that, so Jesus is alone in this deserted place. 5,000 people discover he's there. They come to him, and he's tired. That's the reason he's there. But he looks out at them, and he has pity for them because they're like sheep without a shepherd. And so it makes the reader immediately go to, well, here's Psalm 23 being lived out in a whole new way. So there's lots of things that I think when you start Mark's gospel, you can do a prelude to what you're going to talk about over this next year, all these great things that are in Mark's gospel, so that when people hear that, they say, oh, there he goes again, immediately, the urgency of do you stand up, do you stand up or don't you stand up? This is your opportunity. It's right now. You might not get this opportunity again. You might not get the second chance. And so to express that in terms of Mark. But the beginning of Mark's gospel is with John the Baptist. So maybe if I say a little bit about John the Baptist, who is all about Isaiah, and you can give us the rest of the story. So that for both John the Baptist and Jesus, Isaiah is their go-to guy. I mean, they quote him more than anybody else. And so in the beginning of Mark's gospel, we hear about the valleys being filled in and the mountains being laid low, that he's the one that's going to prepare the way. And in John is this, I think, very much Hebrew scripture prophet. I mean, the whole thing about what he eats and what he wears is all connected to the prophets, and also a very complex figure. So we get Mark's version of John the Baptist, but then in Matthew's gospel, which we've just finished, we hear a different part of John the Baptist, where John the Baptist is talking about the axe being laid to the root of the tree, and people say, well, what should we do? And then he gives them these three simple things. He says, well, if you got 2 coats, give one away, and tax collectors, don't take more money that's due you than what's due you, and then don't extort money from people, you soldiers, and that's pretty simple, right? It doesn't sound like a big stand-up line, but maybe in the midst of his prophecy, he's going back to what you said before. Maybe it's in doing those simple things, like the wrapping of the hand, one bandage at a time. In the midst of what John the Baptist would see as an apocalyptic world, he's saying, plant the tree. And so there's a lot in John, I think, that's complex and holy. But another part of him too, 2 more parts of him. Then I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about his hand. Because one part of him is that he knows who he is and he knows who he's not. Right? So that becomes real clear in John's gospel. I'm not the Messiah. He is the Messiah. And he had to do that because some people thought he was the Messiah. That's a big part of that hymn that we read the Sunday after Christmas, so nobody's in church to hear it. Well, we read that great hymn that opens up John's gospel. The beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And they put in these twice, put in these little things to say, we're not talking about John the Baptist here. We're talking about Jesus because John the Baptist had such an incredible following. But then the last thing I'll say about John the Baptist is how much he impacts Jesus' life. So that some people say, as you read the story, Jesus' ministry, his public ministry, doesn't begin until John says it begins, until he goes to John for baptism. And then Jesus doesn't preach until John can't preach anymore. When John is put in jail, that's when Jesus begins to preach. And then Jesus doesn't preach about death until John the Baptist dies. When John the Baptist is executed, you'll see a change in Jesus' preaching. He starts to talk about his own death. So a relationship that had an incredible impact on Jesus, a relationship that goes back through the whole history of the prophets. And then for us can lead to that question of, well, who impacts you that way? In your life, where transformations happen because of something that happened to somebody else. Think about that.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Nice piece.
Yeah. But I would love to hear more about...
Isaiah. Well, Isaiah, of all, remember I had said to begin with that the Torah portions are read Genesis through Deuteronomy, and there's a prophetic section which goes with each. And the prophetic selections are not read in order. So I go Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy, but then I get a particular prophetic selection goes with the beginning of Genesis, then one from Isaiah, maybe one from Jeremiah, one from Samuel, etc. They are sort of chosen to go along with the given Torah portion. Nonetheless, the most frequent selection for prophetic pieces is from Isaiah. And it's always from 2nd Isaiah, except for once almost. But so the most frequent prophetic reading in the synagogue is from Isaiah. And it happens to be the case that in the 7 weeks leading up to the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, they're all from 2nd Isaiah, 7 in a row. And the one which leads them off, which is the lead off, is Isaiah 40, which is read, Sunday, December 3rd, actually, when it's read this year. It's Isaiah, comfort you, my people. I'm just going to look at it for a second. It's Isaiah 40, I think it is. Let's just a second. Sunday, December 3rd. No, it's not Sunday, December 3rd. Give me just a moment. December 10th. It's December 10th. It's the second one. Right. Comfort, oh, comfort my people. So in terms of, just so you happen to know, the one which gets the most prominence is this one. This is the one, comfort, oh, comfort my people. It's read, as I said, as the kickoff for the 7 weeks that will build up to the Jewish New Year. I love it, and I love all the Isaiah passages because they are all comforting passages. They're all lift up passages. They're all passages which set people up for joy, for hopefulness, and what have you. So if I'm in Advent, this seems like a piece of cake, right? I mean, where am I going? But for the ultimate uppercase H, I guess I know where I'm going. But I love these Isaiah passages. It strikes me, this is my craven self, that's saying, how can we make this more fun? You really can't do this, but you could. You could have a t-shirt contest in which you choose, set out before everybody all the passages of Isaiah, the great passages of Isaiah. You'd have to have a class on this beforehand. And then you have people make up t-shirts. And everybody wears a t-shirt to church. This is more like a kid thing, I think. But on the other hand, you could probably
childlike atmosphere, churches.
There's a way in which you'd almost like to have people. Again, I'm not speaking so much about what the preacher's going to preach, but you'd almost like to have people look at all the passages from Isaiah. You choose your favorite passage and you make a t-shirt out of it.
That's a great idea.
Or make a banner out of it. And everybody comes, you have to choose your right Isaiah Sabbath. And everybody has a banner. And I know for sure there must be 35 hymns based around various passages. And what we're seeing today, well, when we're getting close to Christmas, I want to sing Christmas carols. But I might want to kick it off with 5 of my very best hymns that are based around Isaiah and really hold up Isaiah as a text. So I have people with banners, I have people, the choir is singing Isaiah passages, and we're all exulting in the happiness and the hopefulness, which is Isaiah. Don't want to pass it up.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and then of course we come back to Isaiah for Ash Wednesday, and the great line about restore of streets to live in. And so as we sit here in Worcester, which has got so many great things about it and so many challenges, and we were just talking before about the opioid crisis. Wouldn't it be great to have a spirit that restores the streets of Worcester?
Well, it might not be a bad idea.
Yeah.
I do want to, I want to show one other thing that the folks here have. I have to say one other thing. When I read Matthew 23, which was the first of the texts, I felt uncomfortable because it is the text in which the Pharisees are decried as instances of hypocrisy. Now, there are a lot of historic reasons why that would have been the case, but it made me feel uncomfortable because I think it was doing a job on the Pharisees, which was not true to the Pharisees, because the first set of texts I gave you that we all loved about the Pharisee, about how do you get into heaven? Well, if you've helped the poor, if you've been kind, or where's the Messiah, they're all Pharisaic texts. So it can't be the case that the Pharisees were all hypocrites and all unfeeling clods. So on the second side of the sheet I give you a series of texts which are all Pharisaic texts. Now our friends who are going to see this afterwards don't have the text, but those of you who are here, I chose all these Pharisaic texts. They're from a tractate of the Mishnah, something called, you could see at the bottom, Pirkei Avot, Sayings of the Fathers. They're all Pharisaic texts, and I thought it was important just to bring them because we're sitting here, because I think the full scope of who the Pharisees were requires that we know more about the Pharisees than what Matthew's able to give us. So here's one of those curious points where I would be, if I were forced to give a text, to give a sermon, I'd want to speak against the text and say, hey, the Pharisees taught more than hypocrisy. And here you have about 15 grand Pharisaic texts that I think could speak to any one of us in terms of our own lives. I'll just choose 2. About 2/3 of the way down, you'll see a wonderful text which says, the day is short and the task is great. You are not required to complete the work, but neither are you free to abstain from it. I can't think of a better text to speak about or to by which to kind of shape your life. And then
Zen has a saying about, we are not in charge, but everything we do matters.
Oh, there you go. Or 1 above comes from Hillel, 2 above. In a place where no one behaves like a human being, you must strive to be human. That's Pharisaic Judaism. That's Rabbinic Judaism. And Jesus would have known the text because Jesus and the fellow who said this, Hillel, are contemporaries. So Jesus himself would have known this text and said, you bet. In a place where no one behaves like a human being, your job is to try and be the best you can be. So it's a bit unfair to speak against a text, but I wouldn't want us to leave the text hanging there without kind of saying, hey, there are other materials which I think fill out the image of Pharisaism and fill out the Judaism which Jesus himself would have known and out of which he's preaching as it happens.
I'm really glad you said that.
Yeah. Maybe the question to be asked of that text is, how does one group approach and either understand or fail to understand other groups? Who are the Pharisees in our lives? If we want to say there are hypocrites, who are the Pharisees in our lives? Who's the other in our lives? Does what we say about other people fully describe who they are? Are we selling people short often? I mean, if you were to say they're bad hombres, I mean, who would ever say that about another group of people?
Who would ever say that?
But this text opens it up completely. Who are the Pharisees? Who are the so-called bad hombres? That's buying into Matthew's image of the Pharisees as the bad guys. But if you wanted to do it, you'd say, how do we relate to other groups? Do we fully understand them? Do we not understand them? How do we approach people with whom we disagree?
Well, should we do this again?
I'm ready.
Yeah. So we hope that you'll tell us what works and what doesn't work, and we hope that people watching this now will also write some comments and see how we can be flexible and adjust this, and how we can best serve our preachers.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Mark. You're a great gift.
Thank you. Thank you. This is fun stuff. Have fun preaching.